Hey guys, welcome back. BDC Kara here. We're back with season 12, episode 11 of our Q&A thing. It's all things to all people. It's a podcast. It is a YouTube video. If you find it buried on a flash drive in the woods, it's the start of an elaborate scavenger hunt that has a treasure at the end of it. There's other things that I'm not allowed to tell you about for legal purposes. There's layers to it. It sounds like it's just two people sitting in front of a mic for about 30 minutes, give or take. But there's a lot more going on underneath the hood if you're willing to peel back the layers of mystery.
It sounded more like one person for a while, but I'll take that.
Well, you're here too.
I'm here. Ooh,
the thing is, you're sitting in front of the microphone even if you don't speak.
That's true.
In fact, there could be a third person here that's just never said anything. There's not, but there could be. Yeah. You wouldn't know. How would you know?
Yeah.
Anyways, this is our season of our season of favorites. Last season was our season of Lost Challenge characters. This is our season of favorite teams that we're coming back to. And what are we looking at today if you're watching the video?
So, for anybody who's actually been paying attention, this is the third version of the Justice League. And what that says to me is it's an illustration of just how powerful New 52 Wonder Woman is, both as a supporting character and as a star of the team. Most other teams, not all, I shouldn't say all. Most other teams, you have a star. It doesn't really change much if you adjust the support players. But New 52 Wonder Woman, because her passive is so powerful, it really does change the complexion depending on who you're picking as her teammates.
Yeah.
So that ability to give power to your teammates is a game changer. The only person who comes even close is maybe Suicide Squad Harley Quinn, because she can give power to her whole team. But Harley Quinn's special doesn't do damage at the same time. Mm-hmm. And so there's something about just how... Remember when League of Assassins and Knives came out and that changed how the Batgirls were?
Yeah.
This... Really, her passive unlocked the ability of so many other Justice League teammates, but she was probably the biggest beneficiary of Tantito and Master's Death card.
It's true, because then, not only... As long as you have a full team, you're essentially getting all the power back that you spend twice. So you're actually getting, you're spending 1 bar, you're getting 1 bar equivalent back. And if you get a knockout...
spending 2 bars and getting 1 bar back. Or I guess for two teammates.
As long as you have a full team.
As long as you have a full team, right.
And you get your own power back. So there's a way of essentially doubling your energy. So you spend it and you get double back.
Yeah. And the wild thing is, with Suicide Squad Harley Quinn, it was all focused on, don't do any damage because you'll get your power back. Because her ability to give power... requires for her to leverage Tantitotem, she's got to do no damage. The opposite of Wonder Woman, New 52 Wonder Woman, is she's got to do enough damage to knock the opponent out to get it back. And again, it's just a whole other level. So the version of the team that you're seeing is the one a variation on the one we like to use for Phantom Zone. Minor adjustments. So New 52 Wonder Woman has Claw of Horus as her 3rd gear instead of a power generating gear, or even, say, a combo power generating gear and damage over time gear, because her quick special one makes it super easy to strip the opponent of Astral Harness by the time the first invulnerability is complete. And because of how often Phantom Zone tasks involve doing specials, we don't have Claw of Horus when we're doing Phantom Zone tasks, because we don't want to strip gears on the opponent. That means they stick around longer, they're a little hardier, and we get to spend some of that power that we've been accumulating with her teammates to satisfy Phantom Zone requirements.
Yeah.
But when we're talking about just straight up completing multiplayer fights like we're doing now, Claw of Horus makes things go a lot faster. And that's the same consideration on Flashpoint Batman. If we're not trying to satisfy Phantom Zone requirements for healing, we don't give him gauntlets. And if we don't give him gauntlets, we can give him more offensive output. I have to admit, I do find myself missing gauntlets sometimes when the health on any one character gets low, and sometimes we lose someone on the team more often maybe than we would when we were fighting with gauntlets. But this team is still great for mowing down opponents in multiplayer, even if it has to be a slight, war of attrition where we're maybe not a full team coming out of it, but we are still like the damage output in this team is pretty spectacular.
For sure.
Aquaman has Quick Engine to boost damage over time, bleed, but more importantly, to make damage over time trigger again. And that is not just super helpful when Phantom's requirement is inflicting damage over time, either in total number of times you do it or the damage that you do, but it's very helpful against an opponent that dodges specials, because if you inflict damage over time on their teammate, you don't need to do a special that they might dodge, but they will be suffering from Aquaman's bleed damage over time because Quake Engine starts it again when that teammate tags in.
Mm-hmm.
Enchantress Companion Gear is to stack extra bleeds against an opponent when Aquaman has 2 bars of power coming in. So you do the one, Enchantress Companion Gear's skulls come in, and as they come in, if you launch your second one, then you're doing multiple bleeds and up to a bleed for each skull that's coming in.
Mm-hmm.
And the last gear on him is Razgul Scimitar, so that he's very likely to have 2 bars of power when he tags back in. So he starts off with 1, tags out. Wonder Woman does her special 2. If there's any reason that we need to tag him back in, he's coming in with at least 2 bars of power.
Yeah. So there we go. As promised, our first question of the week. Oh, you have something?
Well, no, one thing I wanted to point out, actually, and it occurs to me again, is that despite how powerful Hawkgirl and Rebirth Raven is, this is another testament to New 52 Wonder Woman. We don't have Hawkgirl. This team is good enough without needing the control over tagging in. And because Hawkgirl's not a Justice League teammate, I would have been tempted to have her on it if she was considered Justice League, and she should be, because I believe she's been on the Justice League.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not necessary. We can, as powerful as that quick tag in, tag out is, New 52 Wonder Woman is good enough that she doesn't even need it. I want to point that out because, we always, no, not always, we a lot of times we extol the virtues of how Hawkgirl and Rebirth Raven are S tier characters, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
So there we go. So as promised, the first question of the week is coming from Burke's Homemade Memes.
Or Burke Show Me Mad MMS.
Yeah. And so they write that out the way that you pronounced it sillily.
No, they did a different way.
Oh, they say Burke's show made my meme reporting here. And then they also say in brackets, a request, I suppose, but I loved how you pronounced my name the first time. Can I use that audio in the future? And I don't know if you replied at the time, but...
Yeah, this is an old comment, but it was worth keeping around. We've had it for a while.
But I would say, first off, yes, you can use that audio in the future if we're talking about you, for sure. So this is a relatively old question, and I think we'll just have to... I remember roughly what was being talked about, but us and the audience together will have to sort of context clues it, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's worth talking about by itself, sort of separate from what we said exactly. So that response was a pretty expected one and a logical one. The discussion was initially about sort of the requirements of you as you get more successful, and specifically the way that external factors can influence sort of
expectations, like how certain expectations I think are more powerful.
Well, and separate from expectations, the way pragmatically, like when your and other people's livelihoods are depending on something creative, that it constrains the creativity. So they say, that response is pretty expected one and a logical one, but I'm definitely not a logical person. If I get a sponsor, it has to be something I actually use, or at least something I actually approve. Yes, there's the quote, what if you get 10 million instead of 1 million? Obviously, I will accept more sponsors if it's 10 million. Heck, 1 million Canadian, the strongest currency, is a nice deal. But I have a line, and I believe many others do. And no matter what, I want control of the stuff that is labeled under the name. I actually have a long-term project that is benched and gathering dust that I want to fulfill. And to get to happen in this reality, I will need to sell some things out. But due to my stubbornness, I would rather sell maybe 10% of the project for 5,000 than 70% for 7 million. I know there's the, quote, you won't act like this if you actually have the money in front of you, which I agree, but I've given up opportunities, and in the back of my mind, I'm like, wow, I'm stupid. Should have done that instead. However, I know that if I was given another chance, I would have still done the same exact thing. No, it's not because I'm a resilient person, but rather this was a long explanation of exposing as an anti-opportunist and truthfully idiot. On the topic of politics, I myself have done some quote podcasts, which was essentially me drinking and getting drunk and talking about stupid stuff with others, which turned out rather fun and there were some spicy topics. I like to divide people in two different big sections. One for the sole purpose of proving themselves right, no matter what it takes, and two, wanting to have a discussion. Obviously there's a middle ground, and thankfully most of us may not agree on something, but we at least level-headed enough to respect each other. And, to the important part, Injustice storyline is pretty political. Like, the premise of the story was about Superman having enough and Batman still sticking to his rule. There's times that people see things and answer, I kind of agree with Superman. The most dangerous part about these two characters is that you can at least see why they are like this, not necessarily accept/approve it, and then, in brackets, sympathy versus empathy. Superman's moral decay throughout the comics made it that there's no turning back, and I felt was forcing the violence for the sake of the story. It's been a long time since I even touched the book, so my old man memory may be affecting me. So there's kind of different sections to this comment, right? It's in a lot of ways applying to a lot of different stuff we've touched on at the time. But do you wanna sort of maybe do it one section at a time?
I'm gonna jump around here.
Okay.
And the one thing that stands out to me, because I want to make sure we get a chance to talk about this before I forget, is that the Injustice storyline is pretty political.
Yeah.
And it's there's so many things I want to say all at once, and if I try, it'll come out incoherently. I think one thing I want to touch on is, do you remember that we talked recently with a friend, was it a friend or a family member, we were talking about Star Wars.
Yeah.
And how my favorite piece of Star Wars media is Andor.
Yeah.
And it is wildly, explicitly political.
Yeah.
Like in a way that you don't often see. Like it's really literally talking about not only government, which is sort of the baseline, not the baseline. That's the sort of starting point of politics, right? Where you're talking about how government is run.
Politics operate at a lot of levels, but the most obvious one, maybe.
Right.
Is like literally, yeah.
And it's political in a way that it's not just about government, but about overthrowing government.
Yeah.
And that makes it even more political because you sort of can't, in some ways you can, if you're part of the majority and part of the ruling power and part of the sort of politics that are pervasive, you can almost get away with not noticing.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, when we were having a discussion with that person, how they
didn't see Andor as political, but they did hear discussions about, what was the new Star Wars show again?
Acolyte.
The Acolyte being political.
Yeah.
And the Acolyte was political, quote unquote, because there was like queer representation in it.
Right.
Because there was like lesbians or something like that. Or like implied lesbianism. I haven't even seen the show. I don't really care.
But it's interesting to me because when there's something that you don't like, it's easier to label something political, that it has some sort of agenda, that it's trying to do something more than just tell a story.
Yeah.
But in my mind, like, it's wild to me that the same person did not realize Andor was political.
Yeah, when I think it's massively political.
Because it's not only do you see sort of in the way that universe's sort of government and the machinations, they all work.
Yeah.
The fact that the main character, the protagonist, is trying to overthrow it, but I guess even a further step back is you see how he becomes radicalized.
Yeah.
And that he would have been happy to be just a cog in the machine until he was forced to face this oppressive regime.
Yeah. Well, if you even just talk about the opening scene to Andor, it shows how state violence and political power allows people to be put in positions of power over people who are relatively poorer, right?
Yes.
It sort of shows the sort of the asymmetric nature of state violence, right? And who is able to wield the violence. It, shows like bureaucracy in the ways that lies and little sort of falsehoods help keep things running smoothly, right? It shows sort of when you look at sort of the consequences of that opening scene, right? And when they're talking about it afterwards, the way that sort of control is largely an illusion, and the way that what's more important is have a strong narrative of control. So this is spoilers for maybe like the first 15 minutes of Andor, right? But he kills those cops, right?
Yeah. Oh, spoiler.
Yeah, I said spoiler. But he kills those cops, and then the next scene is the bureaucrats talking about what to do about the dead cops, right?
Yeah.
And it's the way that the appearance of control, oh, they got drunk, they slipped, whatever. I forget what it was, but it's like, we'll have this story, right? We'll give them sort of a hero send-off. They did something wrong, this guy did something wrong, let's just make it easy, right? It shows the way that appearances matter more than outcomes, right? Because they, practically speaking, don't really have, or at least don't want to. They can't sort of follow up on every time something like this happens, right?
Right.
They're, practically speaking, the police are operating from this position of control. But realistically, there is not that much they can do when that's shaken, right? And so the important thing is for the state and for the presiding power to still seem like they are in control and in a position of power, right? And the resources are better allocated to sort of continuing to put new people down as opposed to punishing people for fighting back, right? If they're not seen to be an active problem. And then, the whole thing is somebody, doing radical actions because they are vulnerable. And, Cassian Andor is, like, competent and wily and, can do a lot, but he's vulnerable for money. He's vulnerable. He's put into a position of vulnerability sort of entirely separate from his own individual characteristics as a person, right?
But even before he becomes radicalized, though, he's still that. Like, that's not anything that's changed.
Yeah.
But it's that he's
But he starts operating in the rebellion for money, right? He is able to, because he's in a position of vulnerability, get sort of taken advantage of a little bit, right?
So he doesn't even have to, you don't even have to believe in the idea. You don't have to buy the whole principle of it and still be radicalized. I love that. Like, I love that, again, so what you're talking about, that sort of trying to scare people without actually having to do all the work, right? Mm-hmm. It dovetails really nicely. All right, so Ada Palmer, science fiction writer and historian, I've talked about her before. She did this really cool series and a small book on censorship. And one of the things that she talks about that was enlightening to me, I mean, it's obvious once you hear it, is that self-censorship is so much more effective. And when censorship happens, if the state that's trying to censor things has to put in the effort to eradicate everything that's bad, they're wasting a huge amount of resources. I mean, that's not exactly what she's saying. That's what I was getting from it. But that a more effective way is to get people so scared of the idea of censorship, so they have to believe that there's going to be a huge amount of punishment for the censorship, that they decide, it's not worth the trouble, and I won't bother. Yeah. And there's a real parallel there, I think, about the idea that part of the power is the belief of power, or feeling like that there's this, the oppressor is stronger than they are.
Yeah. And it's interesting, the way that we talk about politics, I think, is really strange, because you have a proponent of people, or a small, like, group of people who are really sort of vocally on a surface level anti-politics, right? They don't want politics in games. They don't want politics in media. They just don't want politics in stuff, right? And
it's funny how they define politics too, but sure.
Well, and that's sort of the whole point, because everything has almost every interaction between two people has some amount of politics in it, right? It's very hard to have an interaction. And so the way that politics is often framed as this negative thing makes it really hard to have these discussions, because I think to be fair, I think regardless of where it falls on the political spectrum, there's something to be said for politics and messaging being overly moralized, being lazily inserted into something, sort of taking away from the story, right? I think there is, in the same way that, like, most plot lines can be good or bad, and messages, morals, beliefs, anything can be, intrinsic and important to the story and enhance it, or sort of weird and clumsily done, right? Like, you can have a poorly told story that, deals with politics in the same way that it deals with anything else. But politics intrinsically is not a bad thing and is kind of necessary, right?
Yeah, I don't think it's a bad thing. In fact, so I'll maybe add a little bit of nuance to what you said about how almost every interaction, I think if there's enough depth and enough detail, then yes, there is going to be, at some point, you're going to be able to recognize there is. Like, and the broad definition of politics, I think, where people aren't talking about specific political parties, but they attribute certain beliefs and principles to a political party, right? So the same way that, there's no queer political party, but the progressives tend to get credit for being supportive of marginalized people.
Yeah. Well, and I think also to that point, it's kind of like that joke that people repeat that Kamala Harris said, right? It was, you didn't fall out of a coconut tree. You're part of the context of everything that came before you, right? So there's no...
I haven't heard that joke.
Well, it's not a joke. It's just a thing that she said at like a debate, and it became like a meme, right? Where people just were making reference to coconut trees a lot. But
I must have missed out.
It was just, people were looking at that and they're like, that's like a weird like figure of speech, right? Because she was trying to say like her mom was saying this to them when they were kids. Right. And I kind of don't care whether or not it's true or whatever. Separate from the fact that it's that soundbite has become a joke, I think that there's a point there, right? Which is that no interaction exists outside of the historical context, right? And you can sort of talk about how important or relatively not important that history is in any given context, right? But like if you're talking about existing in America, right? The reason why things are the way that they are in America today is because of slavery, at least in part.
A lot of it, like surprisingly.
Yeah.
Like tipping. I learned just in the last couple of years that tipping culture is founded on slavery.
I did not know that.
So the easy explanation, or the simplified explanation, and again, I'm not a historian, I'm going to screw this up, was that when slaves were freed, they still didn't have land.
Yeah.
They needed to find jobs. The easiest jobs, not the easiest jobs, the jobs that were most likely to be given to them were service jobs. And that would be like serving food. And at one point, it was considered degrading to be tipped. There were white people who were doing jobs that were speaking out against being tipped as white people doing service labor because they found it that was too... So it's the idea that you could underpay service workers so that you would be able to exert control over the behavior and capriciously punish them if you needed to by tipping them a lot less or tipping them more was... and this is part of the reason why really North America is the only place where tipping culture is so entrenched. Like, in Europe, you might round up to the nearest euro or something, but that there's no expectation because they didn't have the same kind of slave culture where they had a large population of people that used to be slaves that were suddenly free and were it's not conscripted, but it's the idea that they were really almost forced into the kind of jobs where they were sort of beholden to somebody else. It couldn't be like a proper job where you get paid full value for your work.
I did not know that at all.
And I might be getting it wrong, but I remember reading that and thinking, not only does that make sense, this might be one of those things, like it'd be such a shame if that were not true. And it was just because it sounded so good and made so much sense.
That you just bought it.
And that I've incorporated it into my sort of understanding of the world. Yeah. But I should look that up.
But, like British imperialism has left a mark on most countries. And for each individual thing that happens, right, it's hard to sort of, or it can often be hard if it's not something that has a very clear link, to tease apart those individual interactions. But, it's not politically neutral that you and me are sitting here right now recording this podcast, right? We are here because of the things that have happened before us, but the things that have happened in history. And there is politics in it. The devices that we are using have rare earth metals in them that are, in their majority or in their entirety, mined in with unfair and abusive working conditions for the workers, right? There's a lot of things, and there's the number of layers of abstraction where I think the kind of people who get annoyed at politics being in something would say, well, now you're really reaching, right?
Right.
And some of these things are very, very small. But the point is that it's always there, that you can't fully separate. You and me can't have a conversation in a void that exists entirely independent of history, right?
Right. And I think that it speaks to the fact, I sort of touched on this already, but it speaks to the fact that if you are part of the majority, if you are part of the establishment, then you can pretend at least that there's no politics, because you get to decide what's the norm, and everything outside your norm is political, and everything that's just your everyday stuff, which is also political, but it's transparent to you because you don't have to see it, because you don't have to deal with it. You're not forced to. So I just looked it up really quickly, and there's a couple of references already in the summaries when I do a Google search. So following the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, formerly enslaved black workers were often relegated to service jobs, e.g. food service workers and railroad porters. However, instead of paying black workers any wage at all, employers suggested that guests offer black workers a small tip for their services. And then another clip from New York Times was, after the Civil War, white business owners... But this is an
opinion article.
Yes, still eager to find ways to steal black labor, created the idea that tips would replace wages.
So that was from an article saying it's an opinion piece saying tipping is a legacy of slavery.
Yep. And then there's there was the historical one from epi.org, I don't know, and USA Today said it's not an opinion piece, this one is just that tipping became popular in the United States because restaurant owners didn't want to pay black workers after the ratification of the 15th Amendment. So that's interesting.
Yeah, and I think even the fact that we have the luxury to look at this on a very intellectual level, right, as interesting, is also political, right?
Yes.
Like our position of not having any lived experience of being black, period, right?
Right.
So dealing with sort of the ways that slavery is still a real and present sort of influence on people's lives.
Sure.
Not nearly as closely anyways.
And it doesn't even have to be so directly, right? It's like the idea that somehow, when people say, well, white people say, well, racism's over, and it's not really, but let's say that it was. That doesn't change like generations of having the opportunity. I mean, whether your family actually took advantage of it or not, generations of not only stealing labor, but accumulating wealth by stealing that labor. That changes everything about how your family is made up, about what opportunities you have when you grow up, how safe you feel to take chances because you can fall back on the support of your family and, again, generational wealth, so that you don't ever need to, so that you don't fear whether it's true or not. You don't fear the idea that you're going to be homeless and can't feed yourself.
Yeah, so let's look at Burke's comment where he talks about dividing people into two sections, right, related to sort of talking about politics, it seems like, which is, one, for the sole purpose of proving themselves right no matter what it takes, and two, wanting to have a discussion. And what I'm going to do, because I assume that you're sort of following your logic from the previous paragraph of sort of talking about politics in podcasts, I'm going to add at least two more groups in terms of people in their relationship to politics. One that I'm going to add is people who are engaging with politics in a real concrete way. They're taking political actions from a place of power and privilege. And then the other group is people who are engaging in political actions by existing, who are forced to be political by their existence, who do not have the luxury of choosing whether or not they engage in politics. Right. And I think, for a lot of people, I think, other than the sort of stuff that you have to engage in by existing and maybe just having strong opinions one way or another, most people sort of have most of their political sort of actions somewhere in that sphere. But there are a lot of people who are very active in political and make themselves into political bodies and do political works. Sometimes because they have to, sometimes because they're forced to, and then sometimes because they're forced to, and then go sort of stepping above and beyond sort of the minimum that they are made to. And so I think politics in that sense, it's both very interesting to me, because I do see it so broadly, right? That it's hard not to find the things that are really interesting, and it can be really frustrating, right? Looking at the way a lot of people handle and treat politics presently, and especially in terms of just how many people are politicized sort of against their will. How many people's where you have on one hand people who want to exist and experience rights and sort of have the reality like acknowledged, right? To put a name to it and to understand it and to work forward from a shared understanding of the influences that impact people's modern living. And then the other group who is very much wants to sort of preserve dominant power structures and politicize people's identities and existences.
So, I mean, we're getting close to the end of our time, but one thing I want to point out, because this feels like the perfect platform for it, is to talk about, I mean, I'm not young, but it's amazing to me the number of things that I've learned relatively recently that I've started to recognize because it's been pointed out to me. And then when I test it against what I see, it makes so much sense. So, the whole idea, the specific statement that sort of opened my eyes was trans rights is women's rights. And it's more than that. It's that there's any kind of minority rights are still your rights. Mm-hmm. Black rights are the rights of people of color. It's all, so the explanation that really sort of made the difference for me was, so if, I mean, the idea really is that being gay is mainly explicitly political because of the laws against gay people.
Yeah.
So when you have laws that vilify trans people, that deny trans people their rights, that persecute trans people, it's not as obvious, but it is the same persecution of women. Because when typically, I think the persecution happens with trans women and less so with trans men, because it's harder to make any kind of rational sounding argument, right? Because the biggest one I think that's used is against trans women's participation in sports. And I'm not going to get into the weeds with that. But the one that's obvious is about trans women in washrooms and how, you know, it's about protecting women and children, which is bold because the people who are most likely to get assaulted are trans women.
Yeah.
But that if you make these laws, if you're a woman, they are going to be used against you. If you are not presenting as enough like a traditional woman.
Yeah.
And we've seen that too. Like the examples where women are actually, like cis women are attacked.
Yeah.
And persecuted for being in women's washrooms because somebody's judged they don't look enough like what they expect a woman to look like.
Yeah.
So that's the same idea of the model minority myth where, you know, certain races are able to sort of slide by a little bit in most cases by racists who say, well, there's black people are persecuted because they're black. Look at these other minorities who are, this is where the model part comes in, who are, you know, behaving properly and they are fine. That's no problem. Mm-hmm. And the real lie, so the lie was put to that during the pandemic where, I mean, usually Asians are supposed to be given credit for, being
a model minority.
Being a model minority, not being, let's use some racist terms, not being uppity, valuing education.
Yeah.
And it ignores all the years of how there was racism against, say, Chinese Americans and Chinese Canadians, Japanese Americans, Japanese Canadians, you know, building a railroad during the World War, internment camps. And ignoring all that, you have a few decades where Asians maybe aren't persecuted as viciously as black people. And then all of a sudden, you have a pandemic. What happens? Mm-hmm. So again, it puts a lie to that, right? Like, it's not like, I mean, where were the biggest number of deaths early on in the pandemic?
It was in marginalized communities.
It was Italy.
Yeah.
It wasn't an Italian flu. Do you know what I mean? Like there was at least in North America, I think a lot of the vectors, and not that you should ever persecute anybody for that, right? Because it's something totally out of your control, but the vectors were, the biggest spread was in Italy. That's where sort of the epicenter of a lot of the damage was happening.
Yeah.
What'd they call it? It was
like the Wuhan virus or something.
Yeah, a bunch of stuff like that, right? Like it's just, I don't know, it's just wild to me that you can still fool people into thinking, like you can still divide and conquer. You can still fool people into thinking that this other marginalized group of people, we're just picking on them. It's that whole face-eating leopard party, right? Oh, I didn't think they were going to eat my face.
Well, I think the sort of larger thing is that on some level, if you are willing to say, if we are willing to alienate X group of people for this reason, and these rights and responsibilities and this sort of mode of participation in society is able to be given or taken away, right, bestowed upon people, then that is a shifting and nebulous thing. And I think there are a lot of those like elements that you don't want to be up for debate, right? Like it's one of the reasons why you talk about like not allowing criminals to vote, right? Because if criminals don't get to vote, then the current people in charge get to decide who criminals are, and the current people in charge get to pick who's able to vote, right? There's a lot of those things, right, where if you like talk about like New York stop and frisk, right, and the way that it's so disproportionately affected black people, people of color, minorities.
Well, that's carding in Canada. We don't even have to go to New York, right?
Yeah,
there's carding,
but you know, people from lower socioeconomic status, right? If you are somebody, if you're allowed to set these laws like that, they get to look for reasons to punish you, to convict you, right? Based off of their own personal judgment, right? And so they're these sort of rights and responsibilities that you don't want to be optional. You don't want to let any group of people pick those for any other group of people, right? They should be for everybody, always. And everybody's list of what those things are different. But, you know, we go back to sort of trans issues. I think participation in public life should be a right for everybody. I think if you have public washrooms, that everybody should have a public washroom that works for them, right? And I'm not even saying just trans people. I'm saying everybody. If people have sort of religious exclusions for any sort of type of other person being in the washroom with them, I think everybody should have, for example, single-use washrooms, right? I think there should be spaces that make everybody feel safe and comfortable, especially when it's, you know, public land or things like that. I think there are things that you should not be able to argue to be taken away from any group no matter what. Because if it can be taken away from any group, it can be weaponized against you. I mean, that should not be your only concern, right? The likelihood that something bad's going to happen to you because of it.
But it should be at least an argument, because we know that there's some people who can't think beyond themselves. And even those people should know better is sort of the point. If you can't be kind to other people if you can't be kind to your neighbor for the sake of being kind to your neighbor, then you should at least be able to not be awful to them, because what that does is open the door for others to be awful to you. That sort of there should be at least an element of enlightened self-interest to get people to behave decently. And the surprising thing to me is that people don't even have that limited amount of insight to figure it out.
Okay, well, we have gone a little long this week, so I think that might be the place that we have to end off. We might actually come back to this question potentially. I'm not going to necessarily commit one way or another, but there's more stuff to talk about.
We should have had, like, you know how we have a spoiler warning? We should have had a trigger warning for the people who hate this, because I've seen in the comments sometimes, well, I love your injustice stuff, but man,
don't talk about politics so much. Don't talk about
politics.
You know what? I think that's fair. I think if they don't want to listen, then they should probably just stay safe and stay clear of the whole channel. I think if it comes up every once in a while, you either have to grin and bear it or click away. You guys, even the people who don't want to listen to our politics stuff, I assume have the presence of mind to like stop listening and do something else.
Yeah, and listen, turn off the sound. You can still watch some pretty good fights. I feel like
that's true. Click on all the ads. Support us on Patreon, but turn off the sound. Yeah. Okay. Well, speaking of that, to finish up, we'd like to give a huge thank you to our lovely patrons on Patreon who presumably don't mind us talking about politics because they give us money. And that is Michael Devries, Irvin Ruiz, Hoshi127, Nora Klimek supporting us on the credited level. Thank you so much for your support, and thanks so much to all of you for watching. We'll see you next time.
Komoda.